Hello and welcome to Common Ground, an inside look at Suffolk County. I'm your host, Sheriff Steve Tompkins. Now, on today's program, we have two extraordinary guests. We're going to begin with Ms. Kim Janey, who is running for Tito Jackson's seat in District 7. And then we're going to follow Kim's interview with Mayor Marty Walsh, and he's going to talk about what it is that he's doing to hold on to his seat, but equally as important, what he's going to continue to do for the constituents that he serves. And so I really want to get straight to Ms. Janey and have her talk about why she's running and what her candidacy means to District 7. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Why are you running?
So I'm someone born and raised in my community. I come from a large family of educators and activists who taught me the importance of public service, of advocacy, protest, leadership. I became a community organizer. And today, our community is at a crossroads. So I want to bring the advocacy that I do every single day on behalf of children and families to the City Council so that we're not displaced from our homes, fighting for good schools for our children, which is what I do every single day, jobs that pay a real living wage, strong, safe, healthy neighborhoods. And that's what I hope to bring.
So, two-part question. First, what are you, well, presently you're running for the office, but prior to running full-time, what were you doing?
So I work for a child advocacy organization. I lead the policy work on education in Boston and trying to hold the Boston Public Schools accountable for educating all children. So there's a special focus on children of color, children who are immigrants, children learning English for the first time, students with disabilities, making sure that they're not falling through the cracks. And right now, too many children are falling through the cracks, and we've got to do a much better job. So do work in policy as an advocate, and I do a lot of work with parents, students, educators, as well as people who work in central office. So really been able to bridge that divide between parents and policymakers so that children have better opportunities, educational outcomes. And I want to bring that advocacy throughout our community.
So where are you on special education? And you know, a lot of parents that I've talked to, a lot of kids have the IEP,
yes,
you know, the individual plan, education plan for them. What's your thought on what we need to do as a community to make sure that kids that are somewhat educationally challenged have the same benefits as kids that don't?
Absolutely, that is so important, and I'm proud of the work that my organization does to serve students with disabilities. We passed the first in the nation law, special education law, guaranteeing education to students who have disabilities. And when children have different learning abilities, it's important to make sure that they are included with their peers in the classroom. And sometimes schools don't always do the best that they can by those students. And other times there are schools that may over-identify children of color, in particular boys, for other issues, but as an IEP issue. And so it's important that we make sure that if a student has a learning disability, that they are getting the services that they need to succeed. And right now, too many children are falling through the cracks.
Where do you stand on charter versus public, or do you stand in, I mean, what's your thought? Are you just about educating the whole child, or do you see a delineation between charter and public schools?
So I value, I understand from my work as an organizer that parents are trying their best to get the best for their children. They're choosing all types of things, whether it's traditional public schools, charter, Metco, Catholic school. Some parents want to homeschool. Right. I respect that. I spend my time and have dedicated my entire career to supporting what is happening with our public schools, with Boston Public Schools, because that's where the vast majority of our children are. 75% of all children in Boston go to Boston Public Schools. The vast majority of those children are children of color, 87%. The vast majority of them live in poor communities and are falling through the cracks. We are not doing enough to close opportunity and achievement gaps for our children. And so that's where I spend my time, fighting to make those schools better, our schools in Boston better for the children who live here.
A few moments ago, you mentioned that your community is at a crossroads. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's just a very critical time, I think, in our nation. We see what's happening in Washington. We see in our city this economic boom that's happening, and too many families being left out of that opportunity. Too many families being pushed out of the community. And so what we do in terms of making sure that everyone can stay in the city of Boston and benefit from all that Boston has to offer. I mean, Boston is a world-class city. It's a diverse city, and we should make sure that everyone has access to opportunity to move up the ladder, to stay, raise their families here, have good jobs. We've got to do much more to close the income inequality that we see that's running rampant. You know, there's a huge wealth gap between what black families have compared to white families, what they have, and we need to close those gaps. And I think city government has a role to play.
Well, how does Kim Janey effectuate that change?
Well, I think my experience working in policy already, my experience as a community organizer, I think is really important. I'm someone who really believes in the power of us coming together to tackle these tough challenges. I don't think there's any one person that's going to come with snap their fingers. There's no magic pill here to take. We all have to roll up our sleeves, and so being someone who knows how to bring people together to come up with collective goals that we share, an action plan, and move forward, I think is going to be very important. And I would bring those skills as an organizer to the City Council.
So one of the things that I talk, when you talk about community, one of the things that gives me pause about community is all of the high-priced units, housing units that's coming online. And a lot of people are being priced out of their communities. In fact, people who's lived in those communities for generations.
Exactly.
Cannot afford to live there anymore. Talk to me about the need for more workforce housing, low and moderate income housing.
Exactly. So that's exactly right. And I'll give you a personal example. My mother's grandparents bought a house in the 1920s in the South End. Beautiful brownstone. Spent a lot of my childhood at that house. They bought it for $2,000. Last year, one unit in this brownstone sold for $1.5 million. And some people think, well, maybe that's a nice way to pass on generational wealth to the next generation. Right. But we weren't able to hold on to that house, and we were displaced through gentrification, and that happened in the South End, and we see the same thing happening in Roxbury, where I live now. And so making sure that we have the right mix of housing is critically important to stabilizing our communities, making sure that there is housing for folks who have, the lowest income bracket, but also that workforce moderate income in the middle. There are so many working families who earn too much money to qualify for a subsidy, don't earn enough to pay market rate, and literally are just being squeezed and pushed right out of our community. So we need to make sure that there is something on the entire spectrum, and that we have mixed income communities that will help stabilize. And otherwise we'll have these great concentrations of poverty, and then when we see the economic segregation, oftentimes it's racial segregation, and then it just perpetuates a lot of the challenges that we've seen over the years in our community.
So talk to me about this whole issue around DACA and immigrants and immigration. I mean, when I was growing up, we were always taught that this nation was welcoming, and that people from all over the globe would come here and they can improve their station in life and do right by themselves and their families and their communities. Not so much anymore. It seems like all of a sudden, we've got to have this change. And interestingly enough, the change of keeping people out is either in the Middle East or our southern border, not our northern border, you see. And I'm concerned about that. I'm curious as to where you come down.
I'm very concerned as well. I stand firmly and proudly with my immigrant brothers and sisters, and I think in Boston we've done better in terms of our response and making sure that children in Boston Public Schools, as an example, who are undocumented and don't have papers necessary, that they're protected and have every right to get an education. And we need to we are stronger, as a community, when we acknowledge what all of us have to contribute. our immigrant brothers and sisters, whether or not they have papers or don't have papers, all of us from all walks of life. And so I firmly believe and supporting, and I would be a strong advocate in making sure that their rights are protected, that their voices are being heard.
I want to go back to education for a second. Talk to me about bilingual education. Are you for or against bilingual education?
I'm very pro dual language immersion. I think it's so important for not just how we educate students who come to this country and are learning English as English language learners, but for all students. There is something very powerful about the bilingual brain, and there's been lots of studies about what it does in terms of helping us think differently. You know, how we can solve problems better, faster, easier when we are bilingual. And so I'm a big proponent of it. I'm learning a second language myself, and so I speak Spanish, or at least I try to speak Spanish.
Right.
I've done some work within, working with parents, advocating and pushing for a new dual language school, and so I'm proud of that accomplishment. In 2014, a new bilingual school opened up, serving Spanish and English, and we need to do more. We need to do other languages as well. So I think that is incredibly important. While speaking on education, and since I'm sitting here with the sheriff, I think it's also important to mention the work that I've done around trying to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline and making sure we're doing much more to really break down those barriers that children are facing. Right now, we see too often the response being punitive. We see exclusion from the classroom, either through expulsion or through suspension. And so, you know, my organization passed a statewide law that says alternatives must be used first, which is great.
Awesome.
And there's much more that we need to do in terms of restorative justice practices and making sure we're rebuilding relationships with students rather than pushing them out of the classroom. We know when a child doesn't get a good education, that we see chronic unemployment, we see you're more likely to drop out, you're more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, and so we just have to do more. I believe strongly in Frederick Douglass's quote that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, and so I think the more we can do around prevention and intervention, the better off we are.
And that's
as a
critically
community.
important, particularly when you talk about Black and brown populations.
Exactly.
So I run an organization where 65% of my inmate population is Black or brown, in a Commonwealth where that same demographic is about 17 or 18%. And so I think that speaks mightily to the dysfunction that we're experiencing in this country, not with just putting Black and brown individuals in jail, but we have 2.3 million of our American citizens in jail, more than any industrialized nation on the planet. We really have to look at how we're throwing all this brain power away. I mean, if we are the leaders of the free world, how do we retain that position if we are handicapping a lot of our citizens? You know, I just don't think that it works. I don't think it's healthy. But let me ask you about this, about employment, jobs and job training and the need for more of that. How would you work within the city council structure to enforce that we need more jobs?
Right, we need more jobs that pay a real living wage. So making sure that families can actually stay in our community, that they're earning enough to stay. But beyond that, I'd like to see us do more to really support entrepreneurship. I think it's one thing to argue, you know, for more jobs where people work for someone else. And I think as a society, that's what we're taught to do. You know, you go to school so that you can go to college and so you can go work at some corporation. And it's really the people at the top of that corporation that, you know, have most of the wealth, and the rest of us are kind of struggling just to kind of hold on and make ends meet. So there, I think, are some models that we have. Certainly, I would give a shout out and plug to Black Market as a nice business model. My family started that as a way to really bring together Black artists, Black business owners, entrepreneurs to showcase their businesses, but also as a way for them to really build their business, to build their customer base, to show a real track record of cash flow so that they can then start their own bricks and mortar business somewhere else. And I think we can be creative and innovative in that approach. I think doing more in terms of having incubator space in different communities could help people get the training that they need to kind of go to the next level or an entry-level position.
So I live by the adage that our differences are our strengths. And you have a president now that's leading this country, I think, in the opposite direction. I'm very concerned about the racial divide. I'm very concerned about the way we communicate with one another. I think it's just very dangerous and defeating. What do you think, what's your thoughts on this kind of, not just the partisan divide amongst our politicians, but the fact that the leader of the so-called free world is a gentleman who is like taking us, I believe, and this is just my opinion, down the wrong path and dividing people versus uniting people. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly. I don't know what more I would add, but I think it is very dangerous. It's very divisive, and I think our response locally here in Boston is, we need to be the example. We need to come together to fight against those forces. There are some dangerous policies coming from Washington, and I think how we respond locally and how we put forth things proactively will be very, very important.
What do you think about
to combat that?
Oh, I agree with you.
Yes.
Talk to me about the opiate scourge that's not only running rampant in the Commonwealth but across the nation. To me, it almost seems like overnight. And because of the job, I have to go to conferences in different states, and it's everywhere. You see a lot of homeless, and you see a lot of people that are drug addicted.
Right.
How do we get our arms around changing that dynamic?
Right, and we see a lot of it right in the community that I hope to serve and represent as a city councilor. So District 7 is made up of Roxbury, South End, Dorchester, and Fenway. And the so-called meth mile is right smack, in the middle of it. And I think the good news here is that the response is somewhat different than what it's been in the 90s and 80s when others were...
Meaning that it's a health problem now and not a crime problem. Criminal problem, right.
Exactly. Right. And so I think that's absolutely the right response, that it's a public health issue and we need to fight it with treatment.
As it was in the 80s, though.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But back to your earlier point around, what I heard anyway, around some systemic issues around race and class that have been left unaddressed. Now people are responding in a way that it is a public health issue. It always was a public health issue, you're absolutely right. But the response wasn't that. The response was to lock people up.
That's right.
And we've gone too long criminalizing people with substance abuse issues, people who are black and brown, are males, young people, children. That is not the way to go. I think with substance abuse, we have to not only be compassionate, but we have to have solutions that are treatment focused, that we can help people get clean, rebuild their lives, restore relationships. Right. I mean, it takes a toll on families, friendship,
and communities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People need then help getting housing, jobs. This issue again hits home for me. My uncle overdosed back in the 80s. On heroin, and again, the response was not, a public health. I mean, it was kind of under the radar, and our family certainly had to grieve with the loss of my uncle and the challenges that he had, but that is not how this was viewed back then. Back then it was really a criminal issue, and the response was to lock people up.
So we have about 45, 60 seconds left. I want you to look into that camera over there, and I want you to talk to the viewers and tell them why they should give you their vote to be the next representative, the next city councilor of District 7.
So thank you so much for this opportunity again. For those just tuning in, my name is Kim Janey. I'm running for Boston City Council to represent Roxbury, South End, Dorchester, and Fenway. I hope to earn your vote on November 7th as someone who has very deep roots in our community. I am a community organizer, so I know how to bring people together to get things done, and I have a lot of experience working in policy. It's what I do now in my day job. If you have any questions or would like to learn more, please feel free to check out my website at www.kimjaney.org. Again, I hope to earn your vote on November 7th. Thank you.
Well, look,
thank you.
Oh, no, listen, this is what we do. I thank you, particularly at this time when you're campaigning, when you're out there. I think we were talking a couple of days ago about your sneakers and how you've worn those sneakers out, and you're going to...
But I have 5 more weeks.
Right,
I have 5 more weeks, so they have to hold on.
Oh, really? So you're not going to get another pair, huh? You're going to just wear those ones out.
5 more weeks.
Well, look, thanks for coming on, and thanks for talking
you.
to us about the issues of importance to our viewers and the issues of importance to yourself.
Thank you
good
so
luck
much.
to you. Okay.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Great. All right, folks, we're going to take a break, and on the other side, we're going to return with Boston's Mayor, Marty Walsh. Please do stay tuned.